Hey everybody, it's David Matsumoto from HumanTel. I wanted to talk today about an interesting article I ran across recently from the Journal of Neuroscience, published in December of 2025, entitled "The Neural Tracking of the Maternal Voice in the Infant Brain." And let me tell you why I'm interested in this, because some of you may have heard this before, but the whole reason why I got into this field, and a lot of things that occurred in my career, is basically by happenstance and lucky circumstances. So, years and years and years ago, when I was an undergraduate at the University of Michigan, plugging along in my undergraduate career, I was asked at the end of my junior year there, or I was approached by Dr. Eugene Bernstein, who I didn't know at the time was a very famous social psychologist, and he asked me, would I like to be part of the University of Michigan Psychology Department Honors Program? And I said, of course, yes, that's great. What do I got to do? And he told me, well, you got to do a study. And I said, okay, that's great. What is that? And he said, well, you need to find something that you're interested in and conduct an experiment. So, what kinds of things are you interested in? He asked me. And I was interested in then, and I still interested in it today, which is why infants can understand their mothers and other caretakers really well without understanding language. And so I told him this, and he said, well, you got to go and talk to that guy over there. And that guy happened to be this very, very famous social psychologist named Bob Zients at the University of Michigan. So I approached Professor Zients, and I told him I was interested in being in the honors program. And I told him about my ideas. I mean, little did I know that had that year won the American Psychological Association Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award. But here I am. I have no idea what's going on. And I walked into his office, and he took me in and helped me create a study. And that led me to conduct my first cross-cultural study, examining preschoolers' ability to recognize emotions in nonverbal vocal cues in the United States and Japan. And again, everything, so much of my career is by luck and convenience, right? Because I happened to be going to Japan in between my junior and senior years in 1979, I think, to practice judo. And since I was doing that, he hooked me up with a colleague there, who then hooked me up with another graduate student there, and helped me create stimuli and conducted and collected data. And when I came back to the United States, I then collected more data from preschoolers in the Ann Arbor, Michigan area, and then I conducted my first study on um, preschoolers' ability to recognize emotion from nonverbal vocal cues, and it was a comparison between the U.S. and Japan. And then after I had graduated, he asked me what I was going to do, and I said, "Well, I was coming to UC Berkeley for graduate school." And he said, "Wow, if you want to be in this area, you should go and study with that guy over there." And I said, "Sure." And that guy happened to be a person named Paul Ekman. And so I wrote to Paul Ekman, and this is a day of typewriters. So I typed a letter to Professor Ekman, and Professor Ekman during the summer of 1981, and he wrote me back, and he said, "Sure, when you come to the area, look me up." And I did, because I do what I'm told to do. And so I looked him up, and the rest is history. I started working with him and continued in this area and whatnot. But I've always been interested in this topic of how infants can understand their parents and their mothers and their caregivers without understanding language. And obviously it's all about nonverbal communication, right? But I was interested in what kind of scientific research there is. And since that time, I've always had my eyes open for the kinds of research and studies that might come out. And so over the years, some of you may know that there's many studies of infants and many studies of young children and the emergence of their facial expressions of emotion and other emotions in general. And today we also know that fetuses, these are infants before birth, right? That they also show developing facial movements from the first and second and third trimesters. And these are very interesting studies that have shown that around 7 or 9 weeks of gestation, some basic facial movements start appearing, like mouth opening or eyebrow movement. And by 11 or 14 weeks, there appears to be some isolated facial actions like grimaces or sucking or yawning that are observable. And then from 20 weeks onwards, there's more complex sequences and spontaneous expressions. I use the word expression loosely because an expression implies that there's something inside that is being expressed, right? But let's leave that aside for a second. But there's these expressions that are increasing. And then by the third trimester, which is about 28, 32 weeks and more, movements become more integrated and they resemble coordinated expressions like we have in infants and young children and the older. So what is observed via, and these studies are being done in the womb, right? Via ultrasound or MRI, and they're picking up sucking and swallowing motions, mouth opening and closing, lip pursing, eye movements, grimace-like contractions, yawning, crying-like shapes and figures, cheek and tongue movements. And of course, it's difficult to make inferences that these are emotional expressions, right? Because many fetal facial movements may be reflexive or related to neural or motor development and not necessarily emotional states that we know of them today. I think that's probably true also for very young infants as well in terms of their facial movements. And some patterns like mouth opening and swallowing reflect preparation for feeding. Others may reflect responses to stimuli like taste or touch or maternal stressors. And as I mentioned, interpreting facial expressions as emotions is very, very speculative. But the evidence shows that there's a development of affective systems, but not clear emotional states comparable to infants, right? Okay, and then beyond the fetal, infants before birth studies, there are other studies that capture infants and their facial expressions, and people see quite clearly that there's an emergence of facial expressions from crying to more differentiated negative states across the first two years of life. And there's a large body of literature that demonstrates that even infants as young as 7 months old can discriminate emotions because so they know the difference between a happy face and a sad face, for example. At least, and you can't ask them this, right? So these studies are conducted by measuring brain waves, oftentimes on the infants. And so there's that evidence as well. So with that backdrop, I came across this very interesting study, as I mentioned, published in the Journal of Neuroscience on the neural tracking of maternal voices in the infant brain. And this study was notable because it examined whether infants can track their mother's voices better than others' voices. And in this study, 25 infants participated. And before the study, the data collection occurred, their mothers came in and audio recorded a story. So there's the infant's mother and then a whole bunch of other mothers that are part of, they have infants in the study as well. They're audio recording a story. And then during the study, an infant is then presented with either their own mother's narration or a stranger's narration while their EEG brainwaves are being recorded. And the analyses indicated that infants' brain activity showed, first of all, clear signatures in the infant brain, neurally tracking both narrations, so the mother's as well as the stranger's voice. But tracking the mother's voice was consistently stronger than tracking of the stranger's voice, despite both having comparable acoustic properties. And so and that's a really interesting aspect of this study because they held constant the story and thus the acoustic properties of the story that the mothers who are narrating the stories were producing. So again, this is further evidence to show that infants are coming into the world in tune with their mothers and other caregivers' emotions portrayed in faces and voices, and learning of which probably starts neonatally. I happen to believe that a lot of this learning to recognize mom's states and voices and then of course when they are born their faces probably starts neonatal. Well, of course with the voice starts neonatally. So we're slowly building this mountain of evidence from before birth until till after birth in these infants that makes it very reasonable for me to infer that infants are coming into the world already really in tune with their mothers and probably other very close caregivers into their nonverbal cues, both vocally and then after when they're born facially, and thus reading their emotions on some level, right? On some level. And so it seems to me that we're getting closer and closer to more concrete scientific evidence. To my original question, and of course, now as a parent and as a grandparent, when I first thought about it, I was a kid, I was a 20-year-old kid, but now as a parent and as grandparent, of course, infants come into the world with disability, but it's very clear. It's very interesting to see this backed up now by science. 40 years later, there'll probably be other kinds of studies like this as we're moving forward, and the future is very interesting in this area. Anyway, I thought I'd bring this to everybody's attention, and I hope that was interesting for everybody. Talk to you again. See ya. Bye bye.